Then, hello again. Welcome to today's talk. I've actually decided to turn around a little bit the order of the topics I want to cover. So I thought I would first talk about what is a broader topic, namely how we can use digital technologies to support sustainability. And then I would move to the topic of human-centered AI as an even more specialized kind of technology, and what we need to think about and how we can use potentials of AI to support sustainability. Maybe just briefly, why this topic for today's talk, why I decided to talk about that? Well, obviously, this is very closely related to my research area that focuses on the human-centered design of intelligent systems, and specifically for supporting sustainability. This is a very broad area, and as always, there are some very more specific focal areas. And so what I focus on is specifically what can we do with interactive systems? How can we design them in a way which considers the human as the main part of the system and what it should be supported, but also how it can be designed in a way that considers also the social context, the environmental aspects of the intended use and application of the systems. That is what is meant with the design of socio-technical systems. In designing such kind of systems to support sustainability, different types of techniques can be used and for different purposes. And one of my research topics is the question, how can we design such systems that help us as people change our behavior to more sustainable practices in everyday life? And that is the topic of behavioral change. And closely related to that, increasingly, is the question, how can we also use the potential that techniques of artificial intelligence offer us to support these kinds of processes, to support more sustainable practices? And the question, how can we design artificial intelligence applications so that they actually achieve that? And one design principle or a whole area of approaches in that sense is the so-called human-centric artificial intelligence, which tries to say that not the technology should be in the focus of our attention, but the intended context of its use, the human values, the human needs, but also the societal and environmental aspects that are important to consider when it comes to applying and developing such technologies. The ultimate goal is to figure out how can we design novel uses of digital technologies that can effectively support sustainability, both in terms of societal and environmental aspects, but also in terms of economic aspects, and maybe also possible new types of business propositions that companies can develop in order to themselves become more sustainable. So that is the research background from which I come in the maybe last decade or so, and very increasingly there is a lot of attention in research trying to address these kinds of questions. So obviously, being such a broad area, what I did for today, I chose just some selected examples in a manner of case studies to illustrate to you what do we mean when we talk about these types of digital applications or AI applications for sustainability. What type of typical or most common methods and techniques you will find that are used in designing such types of applications, and maybe also give you a glimpse of what are some of the underlying design principles that can guide the design of such applications so that they can also effectively reach their goal and effectively support the development of more sustainable practices. And so the way we will do that, I will not talk so much about the theoretical aspects and the methodological aspects, but rather I will try to walk you through or to walk us through two selected examples, two selected case studies. One is I will show you what we did in a project specifically devoted to development of digital applications for supporting sustainable behavior with respect to the everyday use of water and electricity, as an example for a whole class of applications that aim to support sustainable behavior in everyday life. And the other case that I brought you today is a project in which we designed smart dashboards for supporting intelligent energy management to more sustainable practices, both for end users, so-called prosumers, people who also produce their own energy through solar panels, for example, but also for companies, for utilities, for energy providers. And so by going through these cases, how we designed these systems, why we designed them in the way that we did, to which extent they were effective or maybe not, the idea is to give you a glimpse of the underlying methods, techniques, and the design principles. So that is the goal for today. We will obviously not be able, due to short time, to go into very much into depth, but rather the idea is to give you enough of an illustration, enough of a glance to get you interested, hopefully, in these kinds of topics, and to get you interested to look more into it and maybe get some kinds of first understandings of what are the underlying challenges, but also the potentials of trying to develop these types of digital or AI-based solutions for supporting sustainability. So that's the plan. I think I don't need to talk much why we need to talk about behavioral change in the context of sustainability. This slide is just a small illustration. We all know about the big problems related to the climate change and to non-sustainable practices in both society as a whole, but business, but also in individual behavior. And maybe just as a small illustration, while it is definitely not the case that we as individuals can solve the problem of climate change by our own individual behavior only, but rather regulation is needed, big changes in the way industry operates are needed. Also, we as individuals can and must do also our part, because different studies shows that household consumption accounts currently for a large part of global greenhouse gas emissions. So against this background, it is not a surprise that, especially in the last decade, but also before, there has been quickly growing research, interest, and attention to the question, so what can we do to support more sustainable behavior in everyday life? While there are different types of approaches, some looking at policies that need to be developed, at regulations, at incentives for companies to change their operations, at ways in which we can better manage natural resources, one aspect on which I will focus today is also what can we do in order to support sustainable behavior of individuals in an everyday life by developing maybe novel types of digital applications that help them learn about more sustainable practices, but also implement them. And so while research has been going on about that for at least a decade or so, in the last years, they have been increasingly proliferating different practical applications, of which you see some also on this slide. So nowadays, you will find apps with sustainability tips in different areas, for example, allowing you to monitor and track your use of plastics and giving you advice how to reduce it, trying to motivate you also to be more sustainable in the way you use your clothing, the sustainable fashion area. This is this Wear Me 30 Times app. Or even applications which attempt to give you a tool to allow you to track your overall carbon footprint based on activities you perform, and give you advice and some kind of motivations and stimuli to actually switch to maybe more sustainable behavior, such as maybe using more sustainable modes of transportations, and then see how this reflects in the reduction of your carbon footprint. And finally, there are also applications which you see to the downmost right, which tell which also have realized by now that it's not enough just to give advice to people, that it's not enough to give them just some occasional motivation, but that it's important to help us as people develop habits in everyday life so that we start to automatically adopt these kinds of more sustainable behavior in our consumption, in our everyday activities. So there is a wide range of these kinds of applications. And the question is, okay, how do they work? How are they designed? And above all, you might also wonder, do they work? And so that is something that I want to try to give you a glimpse into. So what are the underlying design elements, the typical design elements of such applications? Why are they designed in the way they are? And which types of applications are more likely to work rather than others? And one, again, a selected sub-area of this type of research is the design of what is called behavioral change systems to support pro-environmental behavior. What is the idea of these systems, such as the applications I've briefly sketched out? The idea is that we can maybe build systems which can support changes from a less sustainable to more sustainable behavior, so that we by designing systems that can help us form new attitudes and behaviors, change existing attitudes and behaviors, or reinforce better attitudes and behaviors without, and that is now very important, without using manipulation, coercion, or deception. So the challenge is, how can we motivate and stimulate people to do something which is really difficult? Change our behavior, change our habits in a voluntary in a voluntary way towards what is considered a better, a more sustainable type of behavior in everyday life. Now, obviously, this involves also a lot of questions which we cover now, such as what is the type of behavior we need to change? How do we know which behavior is more sustainable than other? Are we talking about everyday habits, such as when we take a shower, how much water we consume, or how do we use our washing machine, or are we talking about purchasing decisions? So this also needs to be distinguished, because different types of these things, purchasing decisions versus chasing habits, require different approaches. A difficult challenge, as you might imagine, is by now there is a lot of attention and everybody will at least show some interest, or large numbers of people, in trying to learn about how one can do something which is more sustainable in everyday life. But the question is, how can this maybe initial interest and motivation be sustained over time? So not only how do we create awareness and interest in this type of behavioral changes, which are different among different people, but also how do we sustain it over longer periods of times? And eventually also from the scientific point, but also from the practical point of view, a big question is, how do we know did we succeed? How do we measure behavior change, right? Because sometimes, or not sometimes, it often takes time for these changes to occur. So we might not be able immediately to say, oh, the system or the intervention is working because we see the behavior has changed now on a routine basis. So there are typically some precursors, some, let's say, proxies of behavioral change, some things that need to change first so that the actual behavior changes in consequence. So we talk about changes in attitudes, intentions, and so on and so forth. And there are also some challenges. We cannot obviously monitor and watch what people do in everyday life. We don't want to do Big Brother kind of things, and we shouldn't, to be very clear. So we are relying in the evaluation also to a large extent on self-reported changes, what people tell us how they change their behavior. We can measure some things, but not too many. And as you will probably know also from everyday practice, there is frequently a difference in what people say they are doing or that they think is important to do and what they actually do in everyday life. So in research, this is known as the attitude behavior gap. So there are just some sketched out questions that typically need to be solved or addressed or considered when thinking about interventions or digitally supported interventions to help people adopt more sustainable behavioral practices to change their behavior. As an example, I announced we will be looking at a case study in how can we help people develop more sustainable practices in water consumption. Let's look at what are the typical types of strategies that have been used in different research projects on how addressing the question, how can we stimulate more sustainable water consumption behavior? A typical technique that occurs also in other applications is the feedback, in this case, the consumption feedback. So the first idea has been, let's show people how high their current water consumption is, so to stimulate them to consume less. This can happen what is called in a detached usage feedback, namely looking at an application on your app or your tablet, or it can happen in situ, namely at the point of use. There are some devices you can attach, for example, to your showers which show you the water that you are using, and some feedback also tries to show you, and that's very important, the implications of is this a lot or is this little of how much you're using, and to what implications, to what consequences a prolonged usage of the type that has been measured could lead to. Quickly enough, research has, however, discovered that feedback alone is not enough. People also need to be helped by saying, why is it important to reduce consumption? Not just to see how much one is consuming and maybe whether this is high or low, but why is that important to change, and high or low with respect to what? So there have been also systems which have been tried out in practice, such as the Water Smart system, which has been one of the first commercial offers almost 10 years ago in California, offered by a water provider, by a water utility, providing an app, but also written reports which were provided monthly with bills for water usage, or bi-monthly, I believe, which told you how much water you were consuming, but also gave you a comparison. How does your consumption compare to similar households, to give you some kind of an orientation? Is this good? Is it bad? How much better can it become? Including, of course, also some practical tips and recommendations for how you can save water. In a relatively large pilot, that means a real-world field trial with real people in everyday practice, they have measured effects of 5% water saving, 5% reduction in consumption among the trialed households. So this has been one of the first practical examples showing this kind of system can lead to a change in behavior, although the amount of saving, only 5%, is relatively small. So the question has been, can we do better? And so there has been a number of studies which have tried different types of interventions, and both in water and energy consumption sector. So how can we reduce water consumption? How can we reduce energy consumption? All starting from this idea, let's give people some feedback on their consumption and some tips how they can improve it. Simplified summary of that. And they have found mixed effects. Some have found small effects, 5 to 8%. Some have found large effects, around 20 or plus effects, savings. But all of these have either been on a small period of time, or there have been diminished effects after a longer period of use. So an important question has been, not only can we induce such kind of changes in behavior over a small period of time once people are exposed to this type of systems, but can we also do it in a way which is sustained, which continues over longer periods of time. And this sustained change is difficult because there are a number of issues that have been observed. For example, the more we show feedback, with time, this feedback loses its salience. It loses the impact in terms of how much people become aware of it, because it is present. At the beginning, it is a novelty, but with time, this wears off, and people start to notice it less. That is one of the so-called salience bias problems. The other is also, are these kinds of feedback-based interventions only enough to introduce changes in habits, meaning sustained change? And another thing is, well, people have many things to do in everyday life, not just worry about looking at these applications and how to save water. People have to go to work, take care of their families, kids, go to school, do their studies, take care of everyday chores, relax, have fun. So there are many things competing for our intention in everyday life. And these types of applications are just one more thing. And with the increasing proliferation of digital devices, apps, smartphones, and so on, social media, online, there are so many things that compete for attention in everyday life, also sometimes in harmful ways, that it is very difficult to provide yet another application which is not naturally of interest to people, which requires them to do some effort and conscious effort and thinking into changing their behavior, and to have them use it frequently enough for behavior change to occur, that the habit is formed that persists over long periods of time. So it is a very difficult problem to address. We've been lucky, so to speak, not only, but also that in a project that we have performed and tried to address some of these questions, we have actually managed to develop a solution that has shown to be effective in changing behavior to the amount of creating 20% reduction of water consumption among the people exposed to the use of the application over a trial period of 8 to 9 months. We have done this in 2 different countries, in Switzerland and in Spain, so 2 different cultural and climatic settings. And we did a follow-up study trying to check how sustainable it was. And to our, well, to our delight in a way, but also to our surprise, given the previous research results, we were able to measure a sustained behavioral change even 3 years after the intervention, not among all users, but among the significant portion of users. So because this was a project which, what we have seen, was effective in creating a very significant reduction in water consumption, so a very significant change in behavior over a longer period of time and in a sustained way, even after project end, I have decided that today this would be a good case to look at how did we do that? How was this system designed? What effects did we have? In order for you maybe to get an understanding, okay, what are some ways of achieving results, of designing good applications which can effectively support behavioral change for more sustainable behavior. And what you will see is the type of techniques that we will see in this application by now are also used in many of the different examples I mentioned before. So what are the typical challenges that such systems need to address in order to be effective? They need to be able to raise awareness of people. They need to be able to about the importance of changing behavior. They have to motivate them. They have to keep this motivation over a long period of time, provide them concrete actions they can perform, and help them in performing this in a way that results in the creation of new habits. There are different theoretical backgrounds or frameworks which can help us in figuring out how to solve these problems. We don't have the time to go into details about that, and I will have a small homework assignment for you to figure out how these can help you to design such systems. But suffice it to say that the main underlying difficulty is that contributions from many different areas, such as motivational theories, behavioral theories, and the design of interactive systems, such as human-computer interaction, a design of collaborative systems, design of persuasion systems, they all need to be brought together in order to design effective systems. And it is a challenge because we are bringing together different disciplinary areas, different research areas, which sometimes interact a little bit, but many times are quite far away from each other. And so the overall framing when we are designing the systems is actually what we need to keep in mind is we are not designing a technical system purely. We are designing a so-called socio-technical systems because we need to consider all of these different aspects which are not technical, but rather psychological, social, environmental in nature. And that is one of the main design principles or the underlying approaches. So designing such kind of applications needs to be framed as designing a socio-technical system in order to be effective. So enough said in terms of the introduction and framing. How did we do it? And what worked? What was responsible for the effects we observed in that specific case? What we did in the Smart Water project was, the basic idea was this. Let us see what we can do by taking consumption data from so-called smart meters. These are digital meters measuring water consumption, allowing you to measure it relatively frequently on an hourly or a 15-minute basis, and allowing you to have this data available in real time so that you can provide feedback to users about their consumption in real time, let's say on a daily basis. Okay, that's not exactly real time, let's say in a near real time, hourly or daily basis. And then we looked at how can we provide this feedback in a way which stimulates people to understand whether this consumption is too high or maybe sufficiently low, and to motivate them to do things that will help them reduce the consumption. So we combined feedback with tips on how they can reduce consumption and some motivational elements which should motivate them to do so, among others, understanding what the impact of their actions could be. In addition, we used some methods to analyze the consumption in order to provide some insights for the companies to understand how people's behavior is changing and in what situations the consumption changes could be observed, so that they can better understand maybe also what they can do on their side to support more sustainable management of water resources. Now, instead of talking too much about how we exactly did it, I have brought you two small videos which will illustrate what we did in this specific system. So I will play them now. Let me know, maybe from Ms. Buddrus can let me know should the audio not be heard.
Now, water consumers can save water with easy smart meter access and visual water consumption information, get real rewards for their water-saving efforts, and even earn credits and badges to showcase their water-saving efforts within the smart water community. Sign up is easy and automatically connects your smart water account with your smart water meter at home. Once logged in, the first thing you see is your water consumption of the past days. To view water consumption for weeks or months at a time, you can change the consumption chart accordingly. You can also display metrics like your daily average or the average of your neighborhood to compare consumption more easily. For viewing specific time frames, the application offers zooming features. The complex chart may not appeal to every user right away. That's why there is also a much simpler overview. It indicates whether your consumption of the previous day, week, or month is better or worse than your average. The system also shows you how much water you will use in 1 year if you stay at your current average. And sure enough, Smart Water wants to encourage and reward you to save water. Reduce your average by up to 15% and win points after each successful week or month. For example, if you reduce your consumption by 10% this month, you earn 600 points. And if you like to gamble or just feel confident enough, you can set one level as your goal for a chance to earn twice as many points. But remember, this way the other levels will be disabled until the next week or month start. But what can you actually do to save water around the house and garden? Find out on the tips page. It shows you handy tips on what you can do to save water in many different ways, so you can choose what's right for you. Let the portal know that you read a tip and get points. There are also videos about different ways of smart water consumption. For each video you watch, you also get points.
Excuse me. Now, so that was that was the first part of the system. Just to take a small pause in the video, what we have seen are some of the main design elements. So the whole idea has been to combine consumption feedback in different, easily understandable ways, compare it to past behavior, provide visualizations which are metaphorically easily to understand. This metaphor of a water pipe, of a reservoir, how much water we have still available so that we don't exceed the last year's consumption in the same month as we are now in. Combine this with goals, self-set goals, how much consumption reduction we want to try to achieve, and give different types of symbolic rewards such as points and badges for that. We will come to that in a moment. And give specific actionable tips on what one can do to achieve these goals. And very important, showing not only what one can do, but what would be the impact if we perform these actions of the saved water, of the goals we set, in a more concrete terms. And this is this metaphorical visualization of the impact, showing you how many swimming pools you could fill up with the water that you have been using so far. So if you continue this type of consumption, how many swimming pools would that mean? So to give you some idea how much water that would be, because on a daily scale, we are having a hard time understanding what is 60, 100, 150 liters of water that we might consume. But over time, this gives a much bigger amount, which is then more easily transferable in metaphors, which help us tell how much is that type of consumption and what it would mean in real life. What you have seen in the other part, we will now see it in the next video, is also we have coupled this with so-called gamification techniques. And this is this idea of trying to use elements from games to provide some motivations to perform small actions, which give you some kind of immediate reward, even if it is symbolic, such as getting points, which you can then turn into different types of either symbolic or maybe even real rewards. So let us see how we have done this in this specific case.
Based on your total number of points, you are ranked on a leaderboard. This way, the community can see your achievements and you can compare yourself to them. For an easy overview of all your achievements on any page that you're currently on, just open up the sidebar. It shows you all your past actions that earned you points, even your past logins. Points are also summed up per thematic category, and you can earn badges to boost your reputation as the community engager, the super profiler, or the smart saver. You're not interested in virtual reputation? Well, there's more. You can also redeem your points in exchange for real rewards, like the Smart Water board game Drop, a fun game for all ages. If you have collected enough points for a reward, you can just order it directly on the portal and we will ship it to you. Are you hungry for more points? Find a list of actions here and get inspiration what else you can do on the portal. The sidebar even shows you your position on the leaderboard at all times.
So that was the gamification part. And so the main concept that we have seen here is rewarding small actions, different types of actions, and that's very important. On one hand, the actual measured results of water saving, because we have the data from the smart meters, which are measuring the consumption at a steady rate. In our case, we were using 1 hourly measurements. We can calculate, for example, on a sum up of a daily basis, the savings, or on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, and we can give points for achieved water savings. But in order to stimulate the interaction with the system, to also learning about what one can do before one is actually able to obtain some savings, different types of actions, such as looking at the tips, filling out a profile telling us what types of devices people have so we can give better tips, or also using the application more frequently, all of these things increase the likeliness that people are eventually going to memorize the tips, going to be motivated to try to improve, to implement them, and actually save water in the end. So all these small, immediate, easily doable actions are rewarded points which are turned into some kind of symbolic or real rewards which are known from literature to have a motivational effect on people, including some mechanisms such as comparing oneself with others, or such as achieving a certain status, such as an expert saver or smart saver, or an expert guru in water saving tips. So these are also typical techniques that you will see in many similar types of applications, which, if applied well, can actually successfully motivate different types of participation and usage of such applications, especially at the beginning, before the intrinsic motivation about realizing that one can actually do something effectively to save water is formed, which then fuels a more sustainable change in behavior. My PowerPoint is sometimes skipping without me wanting it. Sorry about that. So as you have also seen, some of these symbolic rewards can be turned into real rewards, such as the small game we developed for kids to learn about saving water, or a more kind of competition-based rewards, such that at the end of each year, the best performing water savers can get a specific type of a reward. Also, an important thing in all of these applications, I've mentioned the problem of attention. We all have many things that compete for our attention in everyday life. So attention triggering is also a challenge for these types of applications. We must not overdo it, but we need to provide some way of reminding people that there is this important topic of saving water, that there is this application that can help you do that. So we have done this in this case, for example, with emails on a weekly basis, giving you a summary of your weekly results of what has happened in the application. And also there was a mobile application which was able to provide you more notifications and reminders on your mobile phone. So by now you have some kind of a practical understanding, okay, how you can imagine such type of a system, what type of features and functionalities it has, and probably you have recognized some from the other applications you used in your daily life, which don't necessarily come from this area. But how did we come up with these specific functions and with the way we connected them together, and why we did select some and not others? We have referred to several theoretical frameworks which were able to effectively inform us what we need to keep in mind when designing effective systems for behavioral change, and how we can design these types of techniques and functions that you have seen. One is the so-called behavioral change wheel. I will not go into detail about that for a reason. We will come to that in a moment. But the behavioral change wheel is a framework which tells you what are the different elements, the different aspects, that different factors that play a role in influencing people's behavior, or in enabling people's behavior, or in providing barriers to behavior, so that you can think about which ones of these you can tackle given the goals that you are trying to achieve. Some can be addressed with technology, others require, for example, regulatory measures. So this type of a very comprehensive framework allows you to think about what is the whole spectrum of things you would need to think about, and which ones would you want your intervention or your system to focus on. The other very important framework is the so-called behavioral change process model. And there are different models which explain or try to explain how does the change in behavior happen. In this case, we took the so-called trans-theoretical model of behavioral change, which has actually been developed from studying changes in behavior in addictive behavior. For example, to which kind of processes and phases people go through when they try to quit smoking or get out of drug addiction. And these kinds of insights are very important in trying to understand, okay, what types of phases people go through and what needs to be provided as support given a specific phase in which people might find themselves. And this is this trans-theoretical model. In a very quick nutshell, it tells you basically that there are different phases through which people typically go from not being aware from the need to change and having no attention, to becoming aware of the need to change and intending but not yet doing things, to then taking first small steps, and then maybe starting effectively changing behavior, but also relapsing to all types of behavior. More about that one you can find in literature describing this process model. But what we did is we actually thought about it very carefully, which types of functions and elements would we need in order to support each of these phases and how we can connect them to each other. So what we did is we adapted this model specifically to how we can apply it to water consumption in smart water, informing our design. And now, rather than explaining you how did we actually map the specific functions and elements and technical possibilities to that you have seen in the example, to these specific phases or elements of the behavioral change wheel, I have an offer. Because we don't have the time to go into much details because we still want to look at AI, here's the offer. Here's a small voluntary homework assignment that you could do. Try to figure out how was this theory implemented in our system. Very specifically, try to simply map the functions you've seen in the video in the slides to the different elements of the behavioral change wheel on one hand. For example, we see one of the mechanisms that can be used to support behavioral change is education. So which of our elements correspond to this mechanism? Obviously, water saving tips that we provide to users are a way to educate them. So that is a clear mapping. The water saving tips belong to this education. So try to go through the functionalities and to map them, which of these elements do they map to. And the same thing for mapping the elements of the smart water system to the phases of the behavioral change process. For example, obviously the saving tips are a way to support the action phase, right? Because they give people a clear indication of first small steps they can do to change their behaviors. But what about the other elements? What about the gamification? What about the goal setting? What about the feedback visualization, the consumption visualization? Which types of phases do they specifically support, right? Obviously, in order to solve that, you also need to look a little bit more closely at what does these phases mean, what happens in these phases, or the same thing for this behavioral change wheel. I have provided you with the references which you could look up to try to do that in order to understand it better and do this kind of a method. As a small incentive, a non-gamified one, if you decide to try to do this exercise, never mind to how deeply, if you send me your solution that you came up with per email, I will send you the actual correct, so to speak, solution slide to you. So that's a small offer for me, because we don't have the time to do this now in this talk. Otherwise, you would have a small interactive session to do it after a talk. Let me know, and I'll get you the solution if you send me your solution. Okay? So, having said that, I have promised you or told you in advance that the system was effective and we achieved some results. So I will not go into much detail here. You will find it in the slides, but we tested it in 2 different places, in a small town in Switzerland and a bigger town in Spain. We measure different things, changes in water saving, changes in attitudes and the actual behavior. And we have found out that compared to a control group, the users of our systems compared to people who didn't have our system have achieved a 21% reduction in their consumption relatively, because our control group reduced consumption by 4%. Our system group reduced consumption by 4%, but the control group actually increases by 17%. And the details about the follow-up study, which shows how this behavior persisted over time, you will find in this reference, which I have included here. And at the end of the slides, you will find all the references where you can see which paper that was. We have also checked whether the specific features, the functions of the system are actually correlated to the observed water savings. And we were able to establish that for almost all main design elements, there was a clear correlation between the intensity of usage of the specific of the system and the specific functionality and the observed water saving effects. And we have also, of course, tried to ask people how motivating different elements of the system were. And maybe the one final point, because that's very important for all these types of systems, is what we have also observed is that most of the users who used our system didn't use it very frequently. 47% logged in only once every 2 months, 30% logged in once every month, and only 10% logged in every week. So that shows that even with the moderate to low frequency of the use of such applications, behavioral change is possible. And that is very important, because in order to be realistic, we need to design systems which fit into people's life. We don't require them to use these things all the time because they have many things they need to take care about living their life and not just using the system. So the question is, how can we also effectively design such systems which work in supporting people in adopting more sustainable behavior through a low or moderate engagement, through sporadic use? This is both more ethical because we shouldn't copy the attention-grabbing economy that is commonly frequent in online platforms. And it's also more sustainable because the usage of these applications themselves also consumes energy. So if they can obtain effects with using it less, they will save energy as well. So this is also more sustainable in a long term. So that has been the story, which took maybe a few minutes more than I hoped, about a case study, how we went about designing a behavioral change system using specific types of digital techniques to effectively support changes in behavior on reducing water consumption. We did a similar thing in energy with a little bit more personalized functions, which I will skip now for reasons of time, but you will find references to check it out later. The results were not that good. They were mixed, but still some interesting insights, and we were able to replicate the model also in the energy case. Having said that, I now come to the AI part, which will be, due to time, quite short, but I wanted to give you a glimpse of it, and we still want to take at least some minutes to allow you to give me some questions and maybe have a little bit of a discussion. So the next step in applying such digital techniques to supporting sustainable behavior is today, of course, the question, what can we do with artificial intelligence as a very sophisticated type of techniques, which could maybe help us solve many problems which are not solvable with more traditional means. First, maybe, what do we mean by AI? A very simple way to think about it, a very simplified way, is these are systems which take basically large amounts of historical data, build from that models which allows them to apply the patterns they have found in the historical data to novel situations they haven't seen. This allows such system, for example, to correctly classify images based on what they represent, based on the previous examples they've seen. It allows them to analyze satellite images to maybe analyze changes in the environment observed, such as in the land use. It allows them to, these kinds of basic model is also used, for example, for things such as allowing robots to interact with people or guiding autonomous vehicles. And this basic model is also present in everyday platforms you use, internet search, Spotify, Instagram. It is very simplified, like I said, and it is not the only model, but it is representative for a whole class of models. Learning from past data to recognize patterns, which allows the system to autonomously react to a situation for which it hasn't been programmed in advance. Okay, that's basically the idea. So what can AI do in sustainability? There have been recent studies which have tried to analyze where can AI contribute, and the answer is in very many areas, almost in all areas of environmental challenges, AI can provide support. AI is already used, for example, to monitor the environment by analyzing satellite images or local sensors to see other changes in the land use, for example, deforestation, other changes, for example, in the spread of invasive species, which is important for keeping in balance the biodiversity. What are the conditions in depth in the oceans where people cannot go? It is also used to manage better energy grids and to also support, and that's the example I will show, people in better using energy or optimizing energy consumption in buildings. It is also used for climate change mitigation. For example, such systems can allow us to better forecast extreme weather events, to forecast droughts, and to be able to maybe take measures in advance before they occur. In fact, a recent study published in Nature has shown that positive impacts of AI technologies could be expected in a vast majority of sustainable development goals, roughly 80%, but there are also some targets and some goals where there could be negative impacts of AI with respect to sustainable development. For example, if not designed properly, it can increase inequality. In fact, another challenge is AI itself consumes resources, and this small slide shows you just that training an AI model, so building a system which can analyze past data to learn behaviors which can help it reach conclusions and provide insights or decisions in unknown situations, This requiring resources up to several hundred times more, consuming more energy than, for example, an average energy consumption of the manufacturing of one car or of 1 year of human life. So right now, big challenge is also not only how can we use AI for sustainability, but how can we design it in a way which is sustainable. For example, that it requires less energy. So this is also important to keep in mind when looking at these kinds of things. So what example did I bring you? What we look at is how can we use simple AI techniques which can be applied with little energy consumption and with little data in ways which are understandable for users in order to support better energy efficiency for end users and for utilities. How did we do that? On one hand, we designed what we call the Smart Energy Dashboard for prosumers, which does nothing more than simply for people who have solar panels and produce their own energy, presents them on one hand, visualizations of how much of the energy they produce themselves, they were able also to consume themselves. So how high is their self-sufficiency? It shows them how high their self-sufficiency could be. So what is the potential? It shows them that on an hourly basis to see when there were highest potentials for consuming the energy they were also producing, because they then no need to buy it from the providers. So then they are effectively saving energy in a way. And it accompanies this with context-based tips, which give them recommendations what they can do to realize these self-sufficiency potentials. These can be some saving things, but more importantly, it can also be tips how to shift consumption. We all need to consume energy for different things. If you want to bake a cake, it will consume a lot of energy. We might even have an energy efficient oven, but it will still consume energy. So the option is not always don't bake a cake, but the option could be bake a cake tomorrow rather than today, depending on how the weather conditions will be, because then if tomorrow there will be sunnier weather, there will be more energy produced through your solar panels. You will be able to consume more of your locally produced energy. So in a simplified way, that's the basic idea. Where does the AI play a role? In the identification of which recommendations to provide to which users based on the expecting weather conditions, the stock market prices, but also based on the difficulty of different recommendations. The idea being, the more people have used the systems, the easier it is to motivate it to implement some of the actions so they can get more difficult recommendations. The less people have used the system, the less they have become used to implementing these actions. So maybe we should first start giving those users simpler recommendations. But on the other hand, the recommendations must not only be simple, they also need to be effective. So we have evaluated this kind of dashboard, and which was very well received by the users. And as in effect, the company who collaborated with us, the energy provider, decided to provide this as part of their service offering to the customers. And I'm mentioning this because that's the ultimate goal. How can we develop solutions which can allow more sustainably oriented services to be provided by companies as part of their commercial offering, helping customers become more sustainable? We have also have some effects of self-sufficiency, which change, improved in some period, didn't in others. More on that is given in a publication. But that is one example of how we can use some AI techniques to support, in this case, prosumers to better improve their energy efficiency. The other example, and I will skip one for reasons of time, is we have also developed a simple but very effective solution allowing utilities, energy companies to forecast what will be the expected energy that will be needed for the next day. So that they know where they will have enough, they need to buy more, but also to know over time how this energy demand changes with respect to different context parameters such as weather or the behavior of the customers. So while there are different methods to calculate the forecasts, energy forecasts for the next day or for a couple of days in advance, short-term forecasting, most of these methods are relatively complex, and it is difficult for people without expertise in artificial intelligence to understand why does the system think that tomorrow that much energy will be needed. So what we did is we took a solution which is based on or method which is based on a simple, understandable principle. The way the system works is it takes a look at the most similar days in the past with respect to the expected weather for the forecasted day. It selects several most similar days in terms of weather that is expected for the next day. It then takes a look at what the energy demand and the production was on those days, and based on this calculates the average that is most likely to be expected on the coming day, which is a very simply understandable principle. We forecast the future based on the most similar days in the past. And we have accompanied that with different visualizations, which then show you what is the expected demand on the next day on an hourly basis. Why do we think that this demand will be expected? This is namely here because we show you how different the most similar days from the past are to the expected days, so that you can have some sense of orientation. How likely is it that the forecast is correct? Because if the difference to the similar days are big, then maybe the forecast is probably not that correct. But if the differences to the similar days are small, if they are very similar, then the forecast is more likely to be more correct. And so we have tested that and found out that with this very simple method, which not only uses little resources, but is easy to understand and thus be trusted by the users, we could achieve a 95% accuracy or only a 5% of average error over testing data of a year's time, which is very close to much more complex and non-understandable methods that are commonly used. So the differences are between 1 and 1.7%. At the same time, we only use a small number of parameters determining the forecast for the weather, sun hours, wind speed, pressure, and let me see, and the temperature, which is also easily understandable for people using the system. And based on that, we have also, of course, checked how much the utility analysts were able to understand the system, how well they were able to use it, and how helpful it was for them to understand how the forecasts are created. So that's the last example for today, and we are coming to a close. That was a very quick overview of an example how we can use relatively simply understandable method which consume more resources, which sufficient accuracy to provide, in this case, energy demand forecasts, which allows companies to improve their operations and understand better how the energy demand changes over time. All of these examples that you have seen, the behavioral change system, this very quickly shown examples of using AI to support specific types of energy efficiency or energy forecasts, are based on the same principles, and that is the human-centered design. And while this is a big topic to go into detail, there is one essential principle there. We didn't start from what can the technology do. We looked at what is needed by the target users, what is needed by the social context, what is needed to consider from the environmental aspects, and then we looked at what technological possibilities have to satisfy these needs. This is the human-centered design principle. And also, we didn't do that only as us as a scientist, but we did it together with users. We performed a number of workshops, focus groups, meetings with the users, not only trying to analyze their needs, but also presenting our ideas for how we would design it, getting their feedback, eliciting their ideas, and designing the solutions together with them. And that is also an important thing to think about. So when we design AI, especially AI, which is normally a very complex technology, we need to think of it both not just as a technical, but as a socio-technical system that needs to consider human needs and also human values. So what is important to these people, social and environmental aspects that needs to be understandable in use, and that it needs to be developed together with the people and the stakeholders who will either use it or who will either be impacted by the use of this new technology. And these, in a nutshell, are the basic underlying principles of what is behind human-centered AI and what is an increasing movement trying to say how we should approach the design of such systems so that they serve the society and the people they are intended to, and to prevent possible negative effects that they could have. So there you have it. That was a very quick and rough overview of two main areas that we can, or two areas from my research that we can look at when we think about how can we use digital technologies to support more sustainable behavior, how can we design AI applications in a more human-centered way, also to support sustainability, hopefully giving you some broad glance or glimpse about some of the typical techniques, challenges, and some main design principles that need to be considered when addressing these issues. Having said this, thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I think that was a really exciting talk.
I encourage you to consider the homework. I know it's a little bit of work, but maybe somebody got interested enough. I see one question, if I can take it quickly. The little game for the water consumption, whether this could be used in other areas, for example, working with financial literacy, I believe, and things like that. Well, I think that's actually a very nice idea. And there are actually, specifically in this area of financial literacy, already game-oriented approaches. What we found out is, of course, the question is which target group is such a game suitable for, and we designed it specifically for school pupils. So ages, if I believe correctly, 6 to 10 or so. We tried it also with students of these ages, and was quite well received. I'm not sure if it would work for an older audience. I think teenagers probably need a different approach. But the reason why we tackled or addressed these relatively young children is because they are also very important potential agents of change in their families. On one hand, of course, it's important to introduce such knowledge early on in the education to create awareness, but also we were hoping maybe they can also help get their parents interested in a topic if they are interested in the game. So that was a little bit of this example, how we can reach out to different stakeholders, even maybe if the actual element, this game, is targeting a different target group. So yes, obviously we think it could be used in different areas, but it needs to be very well considered regarding the target group, the intended effects, and how one could transplant. If there are no more questions, I would just reiterate, thank you very much for your attention, for the very high number of participants in the audience, and feel free to reach out to me also as a follow-up should you have any follow-up questions. I'll be happy to reply you. Maybe just bear some patience. I'm participating here in this talk still from my holidays, but I didn't want to miss it, so it might take a few times till I get back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for disrupting your holiday for this. That's excellent. But yeah, I will close this session, and I'll see you all later. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.